Hi there. This is Scott with GreatScott Knitting Dyes Yarn, Episode 6. Dyeing yarn at home with food coloring is relatively easy. All you need is a protein-based fiber, like wool, the dye, and I like to use food coloring or even Kool-Aid packets, an acid, like vinegar or citric acid, and a heat source, usually a stove, microwave, or even the sun. Today I am dyeing two 100-gram skeins of Dyer Supplier Superwash Fingering. This is a 100% superwash merino wool. This merino wool comes from Italian sourcing and is mulesing free. This is also a single ply yarn that measures approximately 415 yards. I will be dyeing these skeins with food coloring and Kool-Aid packets. The Kool-Aid flavors or colors I have selected for this experiment are grape purple, mixed berry blue, and cherry red. The food coloring colors I have picked are green, blue, and yellow. With temperatures soaring back into the upper 90s this week, I've had thoughts of doing some solar dyeing with yarn in glass jars. That is, dyeing yarn using the sun as the heat source. I have heard stories that food color dye does not do particularly well in prolonged periods of direct sunlight, though. So I'm going to forego actually using the sun and heat and put them in these canning jars and using a water bath on the stove as my heat source. I have pre-mixed 2 quarts of cool tap water with 4 tablespoons of vinegar, and I'll be adding this water to the yarn in the jars when the time comes. So now that I have assembled all of my fiber, dye, acid, and heat source, I'm ready to proceed. One thing I like to do when I am dyeing hanks of yarn is to add a reusable zip tie to the yarn. It acts as another tie to keep the yarn from getting tangled, and it makes a handy handle when you are needing to move the yarn around during the process. I have pre-soaked my yarn in plain cool tap water for about 2 hours. 30 to 40 minutes is really enough for the yarn to become saturated with water. By making it wet prior to the dyeing process, it does make it easier for the dye to get into the fibers and adhere. After soaking the yarn, I hand squeezed the water out of the yarn. Now, as I don't have a fancy spinner for my yarn to dry it, I like to use a towel to wrap the yarn to get more of the water out. Now, for this process I'm using today, I could have left the yarn wet, but it is a bit easier to handle and less messy when it is just slightly damp. I'm going to start with the jar that I'm using food coloring and put one end of the yarn into the mason jar. For this skein, I'm going to layer color in the jar, starting with the green on the bottom, then add the blue in the middle, and the yellow on top. To start off with, I'm going to use the green food coloring and add approximately 10 drops of food coloring to the bottom of the yarn, with 5 drops on one side and the other 5 drops on the other side of the yarn to try and get a somewhat even coverage. Now I will put more yarn into the jar until about half of the yarn is in the jar. Now I will add 10 drops of blue food coloring using the same process. of approximately 5 drops on one side, and then adjust the yarn over and add 5 more drops of the blue food coloring. I'm going to now add the rest of the yarn to the jar and add 10 drops of yellow food coloring to the top. Again, randomly placing those drops so that there's good coverage across the top of the yarn. So with approximately 5 drops on one side, 5 drops in another, and probably just a couple there on the top. Finally, I'm ready to add the vinegar water into the jar with the yarn and the food coloring drops. The water added, I will now put the lid on this jar and set it to the side. And it will go ahead and start its process. I'm now going to set up the dyeing jar with the Kool-Aid. I'll be doing a similar color laying with the Kool-Aid. I'll be adding grape purple to the bottom, mixed berry blue to the middle, and cherry red to the top. I'm going to do this a little bit differently. First, I will add some of the Kool-Aid powder to the very bottom of the jar and put the yarn on top of it. Then I'll add some of that grape powder on either side. Now I'm going to add a little bit of the vinegar water. Note that the vinegar water is not necessary for the Kool-Aid as it already has citric acid. It could just be water. I'm now going to add the mixed berry blue Kool-Aid to either side of the yarn. And then add some more vinegar water. This time I'm going to go ahead and fill the jar with the vinegar water. And then open the cherry red Kool-Aid and dump that on the top. I'll then just kind of give a little wiggle around to help dissolve some of that powder and place the lid on that jar. I have transferred my dye jars to a water bath on the stove. I'm going to turn on the heat and bring the bath to a simmer and let the jars simmer for about 20 to 30 minutes, at which point I will come back and check on the dye absorption. It has been about 30 minutes, and so we will do a check to see how well the dye has absorbed into the yarn. I'm going to get my white bowl so I can do my white bowl color check. On the food coloring, it looks like we are completely clear. And with the Kool-Aid dye, I can see just a hint of red food coloring still there at the top. We're definitely in a good spot where I can turn off the heat and allow this dye bath or this water bath to cool naturally and allow the yarn to cool naturally. So I'm going to go ahead and put the lid back on. And just to take a quick peek at how things are progressing, it looks really great. And yes, the rings get hot quickly. And here's the food color, looks really good as well. And so now these can cool naturally in the water bath. When they are completely cool, we will pull that yarn out and see what the effect has been. It has been about 4 hours since we turned off the heat, and as you can see, these jars are able to be handled without any problem. They are completely cool, and you can see some of the effect that we have going on in both of these jars. With the Kool-Aid, you can see that it ranges from a very strong color to tonal, with a similar effect also in the food coloring with our pastel greens and yellows. So we'll start this unveiling with the Kool-Aid jar. And let's see if all of our dye has adhered to the yarn. Ooh, wow, there's some really great effect. And no color in the water. So that tells me all of the dye has been taken up in the fiber. Look at that gorgeous color. I even like how some of the areas have been left undyed to give that additional gradient, that additional variegation. I'm going to rinse the skein of yarn in some cool tap water. First, I'm going to check for bleeding to see how well that dye has adhered to the fiber. And I would say on this initial rinse, there is no bleeding whatsoever. So what I'm going to do now is add a little bit of mild detergent, some clear dish soap. Now, because Kool-Aid has more than just dye and citric acid, it also has flavorings and some other additives. It's really good to wash your Kool-Aid dyed yarn in a little bit of soap. Now, when you introduce soap to your yarn, to your dyed yarn, you will sometimes have additional bleeding that will come with that. But this skein of yarn is not bleeding at all, not even with the soap. So I'll go ahead and finish rinsing this skein of yarn to remove all of the soap from it, and then I'll hang it up to dry and we'll look at its finished product at the end. Now let's unveil the food color jar. So as I lift out the yarn, the dye bath is clear, which is very, very good. That lets me know all of that dye has been taken up into that yarn. And as I squeeze out the water, there's no bleeding coming out of the yarn at this point. So again, with a little bit of cool tap water, I'll begin rinsing this. But wow, look at that effect. It's really pretty. So with my cool tap water, we'll see if we have any bleeding. And initially, I'm going to have to say that it looks like we are very good. I'm not seeing any color coming out of the fiber at this point. So that is very, very good. Now again, I'm going to squeeze this out. I'm going to add a little bit of detergent to wash out the remaining acid and double check for any additional bleeding that might occur. But I think it looks fine. I'm not seeing any bleeding coming out of the yarn, even with the addition of soap. No, we're very, very good. I am very pleased with what we have going on here. I'm not seeing any bleeding. So I'll finish rinsing this yarn to get all of the soap out of it, hang it to dry, and we'll look at the finished product at the end. So here's the skein of yarn we dyed with Kool-Aid. We can see some of the blue did survive in the middle. We have a strong pop of the grape at the bottom, and of course a lot of red throughout because that bled all the way down. There's still some white spaces, which I think will add interest to this skein of yarn. Here is our food coloring skein. Again, we've got some good strong color of green on the bottom, but there are some light blues, some dark blues, even some teal color that's coming through, as well as the lovely yellow at the top that is also has a very tonal nature. I will have to say that this method of dyeing yarn leaves a lot to chance and color placement in the jars, as well as the level of acidity and the amount of heat you have. But the effect is a really beautiful variegated yarn, and I can't wait to make use of these. I hope you've enjoyed watching me spend some time dyeing yarn and joining me on this adventure of me learning how to dye yarn and trying to figure out what methods and techniques work best for me. If you are also considering dyeing yarn, please do, and let me know your results. I would love to see the things that you've accomplished with your yarn dyeing in your own homes. If you've enjoyed this video, please click the like thumbs up, and if you want to see more, click subscribe. Have a wonderful day, and I hope you enjoy dyeing yarn as much as I do.